All right. Good to have you on the show, Damien.
Oh, it's always good to join you, Ray.
So, first of all, I want to talk about the big thing is I did not know that as an activist now you're considered a terrorist.
Well, more or less, that's the picture that's emerging in the wake of the revelations of the NSA unconstitutional surveillance that's being revealed in the United States. We've also learned that we've been learning this for some time now in Canada. We have similar issues that we're facing here. And this is around the criminalization of anybody who stands in the way of our present government, the Harper Government's economic vision for Canada to become a major fossil fuel corridor to new markets in Asia particularly, and to open up new trade routes for our fossil fuels to the United States as well. And they are defining people who oppose this objective as multi-issue extremists, and that would be anybody who basically has a beef about more than one issue when it comes to protecting our environment and questioning this economic model that's being advanced by powers that be today.
So what, I'm assuming that you're considered a multi-issue
extremist.
MIE?
I think, yes, I probably am on that list somewhere. So would a lot of the people whose work I cover through my publication, The Common Sense Canadian, and First Nations that I worked with in the past on various issues and around pipelines and fracking in northeast BC, these sorts of things. And inevitably, if you're concerned about the economic future, the public interest in Canada, and our environment, all these issues end up becoming need to be a part of the conversation. And so a lot of good people that I work with would probably find themselves with that label attached to their name. So, a lot of people who've partaken in actions in BC, for instance, the Defend Our Coast initiative that happened in Victoria back in October of last year, called for the possibility of civil disobedience and for people to be committed to doing that and potentially getting arrested on the legislature lawn when they made a statement against these pipelines and tanker proposals. And so there are probably quite a few British Columbians today, and also within First Nations communities, as they've been identified as a specific threat group, along with environmentalists. And probably a lot of those people would find themselves on this secret list.
Is anything being done by the government to people who they consider MIEs?
There are examples. I think certainly in the one sense it's a form of harassment when this comes out in the media. For instance, access to information searches done by various groups and academics have revealed that groups like People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA, and Greenpeace are on these lists of basically terrorist lists, as well as First Nations revelations that for some time that RCMP and CSIS have been infiltrating First Nations groups in order to monitor their activity. So there's a form of just an invasiveness to this, and there's a very deeply implied threat. And I think it's not an accident that eventually we find out about these things, because they wouldn't have the same psychological effect in terms of moderating behavior or convincing people to moderate their own behavior if you didn't know about it, if it remained a secret at all times. So I think that's a part of it. There are people such as a man in Quebec. This is a story brought forward in The Guardian recently. Montreal, a man who wrote letters opposing shale gas and fracking development and was charged under Canada's Anti-Terrorism Act and was visited by security forces. So there's a general, I think right now we're at that stage where it's a form of intimidation, by letting people know that they're being watched and that their communications are being monitored. And it's all part of this. There have been other activities that have happened on maybe a little bit more surface level, such as threatening people with audits. The Harper Government approved $8 million of extra funding specifically to go after nonprofit groups, to shake them down and really go over their books and see if they were using charitable funds for, as they would view, uncharitable purposes. And after those $8 million were spent, I think they came up with all of one group that was red flagged through all those extra audits. So these groups are found to be in compliance with the charitable charter and not to be doing anything untoward in terms of the laws of Canada. And yet we're spending tax dollars and resources, and we're intimidating people, all under this rubric of being a threat to national security.
What a joke.
It's kind of hard to believe, but the baseline for what is believable today and what should shock us is constantly shifting. And it reminds me very much, Rae, today, this is long before my time, but I'm a student of history, and I'm certainly well aware of the McCarthy era and the HUAC hearings in the United States, and which was, of course, focused on communism, was this radicalized threat out there, and people were lumped into that group of suspicious people, potential threat to national security, and people's careers were ruined and lives were ruined over this, and it all became quite silly in the end until somebody finally stood up and basically, pulled back the curtain and revealed the Wizard of Oz behind there, that Senator McCarthy, and today it seems quaint in hindsight that we could have gone through an era like that, but I think today it is environmentalism and the questioning of these fundamental economic models that are being advanced, and with some you alluded to in your introduction, some very scary rhetoric about the consequences if we don't go along with this pipeline building initiative, for instance. Mm-hmm. We're being told that we'd have an unprecedented economic catastrophe, to quote the lawyer for Enbridge in their submissions at the last week of hearings, or second to last week of hearings last Monday, he made those comments. If we don't pursue this pipeline project, if it's rejected, it will have catastrophic economic consequences for Canada, and I simply don't believe that. In fact, I think probably the opposite is true.
Yes,
if we continue down this path we're facing.
Yeah, you can't put a pipeline where when they leak with light crude oil at the amount that they leak, if you're putting a heavier, more corrosive substance into the pipeline and shipping barrels and barrels and barrels of that through that pipeline, then you're going over aquifers, rough country. It just makes very little sense to put this kind of money into a project that is going to one day be finite. But do you think that this is like all these new legislations and the way Harper is thinking that it's being ramped up because there's a change coming?
Well, I think the Enbridge project has been both a real disaster in some ways, and maybe, as is characteristic of some of these neoliberal-minded folks, a disaster is often seen as an opportunity. And
how so?
You can turn something like this into a teachable moment, if you will, for how that we can never allow this to happen again. And so you're seeing the already very restrictive public process for around the Enbridge project has been tightened up considerably throughout the course of the hearings. And on top of that, again, I made my submissions in Vancouver, and it was a pretty eerie experience, surrounded by police officers and herded into one little room, and not allowed to actually. You couldn't see the hearing. Nobody was allowed in the hearing room. People had to go to a different building across town just to watch the hearings. A real lockdown sort of procedure, which is really antithetical to the spirit of public participation in a public hearing. It just, everything about it felt wrong. And now we see with Enbridge's proposal to run a pipeline east from the tar sands to eastern Canada, the rules are being changed around that National Energy Board hearing to make it far more restrictive for people to actually even have the opportunity to submit evidence on the record. And so I think these sorts of, Enbridge will be used as a lesson, if you will, from corporate Canada and their political allies to say, look at to suggest that the process got out of hand, that this is, that extremists took over, and Canada lost a very critical economic opportunity as a result of that, and never again should that happen. And therefore, we're going to put these security measures in place. We're going to tighten up the hearing process. We're going to really clamp down on public demonstrations against these things, and we're going to intimidate and harass and try to even take away funding from groups that would dare to question that imperative. So I think that's how Enbridge will be used, and it will also be used as a sort of an outlier that will suggest, Enbridge, that was a bad project, it was poorly handled by the company. I think that's how it'll be positioned in the final analysis, but it will be, relative to that, Kinder Morgan's proposal to run a very similar sized pipeline to Vancouver will be framed in a favorable light, and we'll be told, well, we can't say no to everything, and so we have to let this one through. And already the gas pipelines set to bisect the north along the same route as the Enbridge pipeline largely are sneaking through the regulatory process with far less scrutiny than Enbridge ever received, and have, different but very serious consequences in their own right, because you're talking about ramping up 3 to 5 times more fracking in northeast BC, and the LNG plants on the coast that are planned, and these pipelines, which are, just because they're not carrying diluted bitumen but instead gas, doesn't mean they're not dangerous to the environment. And again, as you highlighted, traversing a very hostile terrain that's prone to, just look at the weather patterns that we've seen recently. We had a sour gas leak in southern Alberta last week that authorities could not get to shut off because the flooding was so intense they couldn't reach it. Yeah. And so that was an early story in that flooding situation.
Yeah,
got lost in the shuffle, but these are things we should be learning from.
It amazes me that after lesson after lesson after lesson after lesson, we still haven't learned our lesson.
It would seem not, but there's a significant portion of the population that has started to get it and has voiced these concerns very emphatically, and you've seen it. You alluded to this before. 96% roughly of the 10,000 or so, almost 10,000 submissions, public submissions, and this isn't a poll conducted by some online newspaper. This is people that took the time to apply for and follow through with submitting evidence to the official National Energy Board hearings on Enbridge. Out of the 9,500 plus submissions, over 9,200 of them were against Enbridge. That's 96%.
Wow.
And that needs to be taken very seriously. You have to ask the question, and these weren't just First Nations chiefs and citizens representing their community groups and environmental organizations. These were also a range of experts in different fields, from economics to pipeline safety, engineers, all sorts of people, biologists, oil spill recovery experts, who all testified one after another that this was a really bad and ill-advised and dangerous project.
So then how come the Enbridge lawyers are asking for more information from the activists about like oil spill recovery programs and stuff if they already presented it?
Well, no, the concern is really that Enbridge didn't present enough information about how they would be prepared for an oil spill, and what their contention is that they wouldn't ordinarily have to do that at this stage in the process. This is still early on, but to a normal person, it shows you how mired they are in the technocratic, industry-friendly process of approving pipelines, which is generally not a controversial one. It's only sort of become that way around the Enbridge issue and others, as people are paying more attention to these things, and they've breached in critical areas where people have a lot of concern, like the Great Bear Rainforest and BC coast, and it's got people's attention. But generally speaking, pipeline approvals are not a particularly controversial or drawn-out process, particularly in Alberta. It's pretty well business as usual. So I think it's kind of caught them off guard, and they're trying to suggest that the demands that are being put on the company are far in excess of what this stage of the process should warrant. But to the average outside, observer,
is that true?
That's silly that you would get approval without having demonstrated the most important things associated with, or answering the most important questions associated with your project, i.e., how are you prepared to deal with an oil spill?
Yeah.
This is a company that has repeated spill after another, high-profile ones, and they've suffered some big black eyes over this, and it's really hampered their efforts, and so it should. And it continues, on not just Enbridge, but we see data that came out of the Alberta government that shows over the last, I think it was 30-year period, there an average of 2 oil spills a day, period.
What?
Just typical daily operation. This was put out by Global TV. A graphic they had on their website that actually showed this in stark detail. That visualized this, how on a timeline how many spills actually happened in a regular, over 37 years. There's been 2 oil spills a day. That's 28,000 plus oil spill incidents, and another 31,000 spills of other similar substances, other petrochemical products, etc.
Holy shish kebabs.
So we need to recognize that oil spills are just the fact of doing business. They're just absolutely and 100% unavoidable. And I did listen to the Enbridge president on CBC earlier this week when they were at the hearings, and he did maintain that they believe that they can operate this without spills, and it's just really hard to digest because the record doesn't suggest that at all.
How do I can understand the need for the need for money to take care of your basic necessities, but this kind of greed, I'm sorry, but I just don't understand how you can play with so many lives, and it's not just human lives, but it's the environmental lives as well that are destroyed through this. And doesn't Calgary tell them anything? Like, what's happening in Calgary is because of what is happening in Alberta. The oil sands are contributing to that kind of devastation.
I think it would be a reasonable precautionary inference to make that based on the leading climate scientists in the world, people like James Hansen of NASA, that tell us that there's enough hydrocarbons in the Alberta tar sands to take us 2 times over what it would require to cross that threshold of catastrophic climate change, and that certainly the carbon that's coming over there today is having an influence on climate change. I'm not a climatologist or a meteorologist, and I don't know to what extent these floods are climate change related. I think there's enough evidence today to suggest we should be really taking these things seriously and taking a precautionary approach to the climate. And absolutely, if we were to continue ramping up the tar sands, that would have a very likely a detrimental effect on the future of the planet. And I think that needs to be part of this conversation. And it wasn't, in fact, part of the Enbridge conversation. The effects on climate were not part of the terms of reference for the whole National Energy Board hearing. And that's another example to me of the kind of parochial, thinking that is guiding our decisions around resource development today, as opposed to the big picture thinking that should be incorporating science and climate and all these things.
Well, that's just,
decision-making.
Well, when we have the top person in Canada who doesn't ask why, life is very black and white, and you don't sort of delve into anything except for what you can extract, and everything about it just is so wrong. From what they spout one thing and then they do another, and the oil sands, everything about it is just wrong. It takes, we have water shortages here on the island already, but we're fracking in northern BC so that we can, use more water than we should be using instead of conserving it. We're putting money into a LNG system when the market is bottoming out and our product won't be even used. Well, it might be used, but we're going to give away raw materials again, which we won't refine, so we won't have jobs, and we won't be making what we should be making off it because there's no market for it. I just don't understand the logic of these moves.
Me neither. I understand the impulse. It's based on a pattern of development and economic thinking that's been very prevalent and well entrenched over the last 50 years, post-war era, in fact. Mm-hmm. It's hard to break that mold. What was disappointing to me in this last provincial election was that the opposition didn't couch a lot of these issues in economic terms, didn't take the fight to the Liberals where they were making it, which is the contention that this is the one and only economic vision that makes any sense for British Columbia, the only thing that's going to provide us with jobs and economic opportunities for British Columbians in the future. And I think we're closing the door to other more innovative approaches to creating an economy and creating jobs by focusing on what is a very antiquated and ultimately, I think, will be a short-lived economic model, which is predicated on fossil fuels and on commodity markets, which are very volatile, as you note, and for which the underlying economics are very good. There will be speculators, and there will be stock market players and some of the big oil and gas companies that will make money off this shale gas boom. But ultimately, the data that I'm seeing now, particularly data out of the United States, we're a little bit ahead of us on the shale and the rest of the world on the shale boom.
Is that fracking?
Yes,
okay.
Fracking is also called shale gas. It's where the gas is trapped in shale, and that's what you do the fracking to release it. And the data, both economically and in terms of the well production and decline rates that I'm seeing, would suggest it would be very, very foolish to act like we have boundless access to this resource and that we're going to make a lot of money on the international market. That's not what the best analysis I'm seeing right now is suggesting.
Okay, so if you're the premier of our province and you're putting $8 million of our provincial dollars into this basket, wouldn't you, or the bureaucrats that work for you, wouldn't they be reading this research, or are they so into just the money that will be made in the short term they don't care what the research says?
Well, there's no money to be made in the short term at all. We're talking like the prosperity fund that Christy Clark has attached to this LNG pipe dream is 15 years off. That's the time frame in which it would fully kick in, and we would see our debt erased, allegedly. Although they've increased our real debt by and attenuating taxpayer liabilities by 5 times in their last 10-year term. So since they came to power, a little over 10 years. And it's far higher than they would acknowledge. It's more like $171 billion. So even when they talk about a $100 billion prosperity fund from LNG over 15 years, that wouldn't even do it. That wouldn't even come close with the interest on our present debt and liabilities. So the math doesn't add up, first of all. But even if there is some money to be made, we're 5, 6, 7 years away from getting into that market. It's going to take a long time to build these pipelines and the multi-billion-dollar LNG facilities on the coast in Prince Rupert and Kitimat before and to ramp up fracking production in Northeast BC for the feedstock for this LNG. All of that is we're talking 5, 6, 7 years away before we're actually exporting this into the market. And this government will probably, well, certainly they could be still in power, but it's unlikely that it'll be the same players or that they'll be held to account for for the decisions that they're making today. I think it was a very convenient diversion from the Liberals' very poor economic record in this last election to come up with this, to pull a rabbit out of a hat and say, here's this amazing $100 billion prosperity fund and this big new vision for LNG. Whether or not it comes to fruition, she still managed to ride that wave to getting elected. Yeah. And that was the first order of business, was to stave off a potentially disastrous election loss. And they needed to create some kind of a story, some kind of a vision that would, particularly one that reassured people about the future of our economy under the Liberals' reign. And it worked. And the media, there were a lot of skeptics. A lot of the pundits didn't buy it and still don't buy it. But it wasn't criticized enough. And the big issue here too was that the NDP went along with it. They didn't question it.
The NDP did absolutely nothing. I don't know who's running campaigns in the NDP, but the last two campaigns, provincial campaigns, whoever ran both of them, they should be fired.
Well, you can see a lot of things on our website at the Canadian.org. Number of pieces answering just those very questions that you just asked, and presenting some opinions and thoughts, not hiding anything really here, as far as some strong thoughts on these subjects that you've raised. So I encourage your readers to check that out.
Yeah, well, I've read a few of them myself, and a few of them I definitely agree. I remember, I'm like, yeah, that's right. It's very hard as a voter who cares about being a voter, to go into an election when you have someone who is, there's not a chance in hell I'll put my X next to their name. But then what are my other choices? My other choices are a party who has told me absolutely nothing, from a leader who has told me absolutely nothing. It seems to be coasting on what the polls say. I can't vote for someone like that. I just cannot. And so then what are my other choices? I vote for, there's no independent on my voting list, so my next one is for the Green Party. And while I would think that if you really want change, then you would not vote for either Liberal or NDP. If you really wanted change, you would vote for someone who might bring in that change, right? But people are just so afraid. I don't understand, but that's for another. This is A Sense of Justice. I am your host, Rae, and with me tonight is Damien Gillis. He is a documentary filmmaker. He is a social justice activist and an environmental guru, I think. One of my favorite peeps to talk to. Oh, and now I can add that you're an MIE, too.
Probably. Allegedly.
You hang out with Rafe Mary. You're probably on that list right underneath him, or if not above. I was thinking that when I was reading that piece, I'm thinking, ooh, I wonder if they consider me an MIE. I'd like to be on that list. I guess
you're talking to the right people if you want.
If I want to be on that list.
Yeah, you keep having us. Have Rafe on your show a few more times, and
I'd love to have Rafe on my show again.
File with CSIS.
I would love to have a file with CSIS until they start harassing me. Then I probably wouldn't love it anymore. But until then, it's one of my dreams to be on CSIS's file. Oh, wouldn't that be hilarious? I would just absolutely have a laugh or two with that myself. So when I was doing some research, Damien, they talked about how our oil sands in Alberta contribute to the pattern of Dutch disease.
Right.
And I remember Mulcair talking about that and getting much flack by the Canadian press over it. What is Dutch disease again?
Well, it's a very dangerous idea to the established economic view of corporate Canada and Calgary and the tar sands and this government that's supporting them, and that's why Mulcair was attacked so vigorously in the op-ed pages of the National Post, etc. What the Dutch disease is a notion that comes out of Amsterdam when they had a gas price boom in 1970s, and it resulted in
their currency being artificially inflated, tied to that rising fossil fuel price, and which then very much hampered their exports, and they're a big trading nation, so it destroyed plunged the nation's economy into recession. So the basic principle is the hollowing out of your manufacturing sector and in other sectors as a result of an artificially inflated currency that's tied to a particular commodity, generally speaking, a fossil fuel commodity like oil or gas. And so when we develop a petro-state or petro-economy where oil is the primary focus, then that we see, as we have over the last number of years, where the Canadian dollar has been much higher than it used to be relative to the U.S. dollar and other currencies around the world, and that has really is attributable to the decline in manufacturing jobs that we've seen in places like Ontario. Mm-hmm. So you can kind of have one or the other. You can have a strong manufacturing, automotive industry, et cetera, in Ontario, or you can have a lot of jobs in Fort McMurray. But the minute they're like on opposite ends of a scale, and the more weight you put on one end, the less is going to be on the other. And we have a total of 125,000 roughly direct jobs in the entire oil and gas industry in Canada. It's a lot, but and they're high-paying jobs, and there certainly are spin-off benefits that would be more than that. But to base our currency, our foreign policy, our entire economy on that one industry would seem, particularly when it has such negative effects in other places, would seem to not be a very well-advised economic policy. And this isn't just the leader of the opposition. This is organizations like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which is one of the venerable global financial institutions that supports this notion of the Dutch disease. Robin Allen, former CEO of ICBC here, that's been doing a lot of independent economic analysis of these pipeline and tanker proposals, has come to the same conclusion. So the notion that this is it would be catastrophic for the Canadian economy, let alone the BC economy, that gets sweet, nothing from this deal. But we're meant to believe that the trickle-down effect of benefiting the Alberta economy will be felt here and everywhere else in Canada.
Have we not learned as a world that trickle-down Reaganomics do not work?
Well, you would hope. Again, what this whole pipeline issue here and the things we've been talking about today, they are radical if you consider the status quo as being, the economic view that is in power right now in this country. And if you consider these notions relative to that power structure and that entrenched view of things, then it is radical because it cuts right to the very core of those notions. What we're talking about here completely, if it's taken seriously and acted upon, obliterates the basis for this petro-state economy. Mm-hmm. And so it is a very dangerous notion to those very powerful, wealthy entities that are banking their future on it.
Do they understand, as we understand, that this future that they're planning or placing all their eggs in one basket is not a long future? Or do they believe that these fossil fuels will never run out?
Well, that's really hard to answer because there is Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, and one of the deans or pope of neoliberal economics, as he even himself used the term irrational exuberance, and I believe it accurately describes a lot of what we're talking about here. So you've seen in the shale gas sector, for instance, would seem irrational behavior to the standard investor or outside observer, which is to say they've gone so hog wild with this new technology, they've unleashed so much new supply that's flooded the market and driven the price down to the point where these companies are losing money now. And Canada, our big Canadian multinational company corporate
entity, but Canadian-rooted gas power player, lost something like $300 million last quarter, which is
Wow.
new to this company. That's been a major performer on the stock market for years, and they're losing money because it's costing them more money to get this gas out of the ground into market than they're selling it for.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty simple economic equation.
So why keep doing it?
The reason for this whole LNG program is that now we're going to take this gas and we're going to sell it in places where they're paying more for it. But to do that, you have to spend a whole bunch more money to get that, to convert that gas into a format where you can ship it elsewhere and to get it into market. And so that just raises the cost involved in the whole operation. It means you definitely have to sell it for significantly more money to make a profit. Well, this is a historical disparity in terms of the price in North America and the price in Asia for gas. It's never been this wide of a gap, which is about a 4 or 5-fold gap right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's a historical anomaly that we cannot and should not bank on being there 7 years from now when we finally get into the marketplace. In fact, all the independent economic analysis that I'm reading today, including Bloomberg recently, predicted we're going to have maybe a difference of 20 or 30% between the price in Asia and North America by 2020, not 500% or 400%. And unless it is that, you no longer are making any money anymore. And so there may be just this, it may just be that all these different players and from the small players up, the banks that are financing them, this could be another housing bubble. We could be seeing something that really, in the end, doesn't actually make a lot of sense, but in the heat of the moment, companies are paying big dollars to secure leases and tenures to pump this gas. They're paying big tax dollars on it. Governments are getting rich off it for a while. Everybody thinks the train's going to keep speeding up and everything's going to work out. And then you hit a wall. And that's where we're at right now. And so we're told that this other plan is going to solve our problems, except for the rest of the world is doing the same thing, and it's just going to become a globalized version of the same issue we're facing here in North America. That's my prediction. That's what a lot of experts are saying right now. It's hard to say what the state of mind is of the myriad individual players and the heads of these companies that are involved in this whole thing. Some of them may just be in it for a quick buck. Maybe they'll be the guys that buy a bunch of shitty, excuse me, I don't know if I can say that on the
Yes, you can.
Okay. A bunch of bad mortgages and package them up into a security and get a rating agency to stamp off on it and sell it to somebody else and wash their hands of it, or get a bailout at the end of the day because they're better politically connected than other people. It could be some of those sorts of things. Or it could be people that are just, off their rocker. There could be people that are in charge of these big companies and our governments that are making decisions based on bad information or that are just simply incompetent. It doesn't really matter one way or the other. The point is here, for me, is what's in the public interest. Mm-hmm. We are the First Nations and BC and Canadian citizens are the shareholders of these resources.
Yes.
These are provincial resources, mineral rights, subsurface rights. We are leasing to companies the ability to come in, take a piece of land, and pull the gas out from it, and we're taking royalties up from them. It's our resource, and so when it's squandered, when it's not managed properly, when we're not getting full dollar, full royalty value, and full benefit in terms of we're going to need this gas maybe someday down the road.
Yeah.
The rates at which they plan to extract it here, we're looking at running out of gas again 30 years from now. It's not a very far-sighted, and we need to be transitioning away from fossil fuels anyway.
Yes. Yeah,
But do we really want to blow through all this supply as fast as we can for pennies on the dollar? And if you and I thought of it as shareholders, if we thought of this as our company, British Columbia, and this is our asset, would we behave this way?
I sure as heck wouldn't, but that doesn't mean that others wouldn't behave badly, because I think we live in a wicked, wicked world. And on that note, we have to say goodnight already. Time flies when you're having a great conversation. I'm going to bring you back on, both you and Rafe, again, because this is something that we should not stop talking about at all.
Well, thanks for having me again, Ray.
You're very welcome. Have a good night.